Thank you for joining us today's Tech Forum session. I'm Tom Richardson, Bibliographic Manager of BookNet. Welcome to updates to Thema and their applications to the Canadian market. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the land we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativelands.ca's website to learn more about the peoples whose lands you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all of that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move forward towards a framework that supports space-making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute work and lead. Now, for our webinar today, if you're having difficulty with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for the presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Captions button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have questions for us, panelists, or for BookNet, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please be kind, inclusive, be respectful of others, including their privacy. Be aware of your words and actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Do not harass speakers, hosts, attendees, or record these sessions. We have a zero-tolerance policy. You can find the entire Code of Conduct at BNC Tech Forum Code of Conduct. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Chris Saynor is Standards Editor, working on standards, including Onyx, Thema, and EDItEUR. He joined the organization in the late 2016, and for the previous 8 years, he worked for GiantShare in Paris as a metadata specialist and project manager, and has been responsible for implementation of the Onyx Suite application in many publishing organizations. He's widely known for his work with French industry liaison body CLIL and BISG committees. Prior to that, he had a 20-year background in bookselling with Waterstones and W.H. Smith. Isabelle Gaudet-Labine is Director of Publisher Relations and the Data Processing Team at BTLF. In her function, she supervises relationships with all data producers in order to support them in the creation and transmission of metadata. She also leads the documentary team responsible for validating, enriching, and controlling the data that will be exported to the French-speaking book market in Canada. In the past, she worked for 10 years in the Quebec sectorial committee for the cultural industry. She set up and managed apprenticeship and skill recognition programs for booksellers in collaboration with the Société de la Librairie de Quebec. She was a bookseller herself, having obtained a bachelor's degree in French studies and a master's degree in literary studies. And not least, she's also a writer. So, over to you, Chris and Isabelle.
So, hi, everybody. First, I'd like to thank BookNet Canada for inviting me to share with you today the use made of Thema in the French-Canadian market. and a part of the decolonization work we have done together in our distinct language markets and supply chains in application of version 1.6 of Thema. So, like Tom said, my name is Isabelle Gaudet-Labine. I will pass the presentation part because it was very good. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm a French speaker, so please excuse me in advance for reading my notes and if I mess up some English words during the presentation. Let's begin by the use made of Thema in the French-Canadian market. In Quebec, we move from Electre, Thames, and Genre to Thema in 2020 after a year of preparation with EDItEUR, thank you, Chris, and with the publishers. Previously, the BTLF worked on the translation of Thema into Canadian French to offer the Quebec book chain a version of Thema that corresponds to the specificities of our language and the reality of our market. The integration of Thema at the BTLF coincided with the complete overhaul of our metadata management infrastructure and with the putting online of a new publisher space, which is the referencing interface used by the publishers to send us their data when they are not equipped to send ONIX files. 94% of French-speaking publishers in Canada submit their data in the publisher space. It represents about 55% of books data received by BTLF. Of course, the fields in the publisher space are built and structured according to ONIX. So let's take a look at our publisher space. In the interface, Thema's referencing is basic data, mandatory to be able to submit a new title to the BTLF. Publishers should choose at least the main subject, but we strongly encourage them to also provide additional Thema subjects and qualifier where relevant, in order to increase the discoverability of their works on Memento and on websites that use our data. So 100% of these publishers send us Thema. Publishers who send us ONIX files must also send us Thema, but their transition to Thema has been slower. Currently, 79% of these publishers sends us Thema. A word about the pre-selection field. Initially, the BTLF made the choice to create major categories, the pre-selection. The goal was to organize the information in a way that would help the publisher navigate and make his selection among all the Thema subjects. This choice is currently being reconsidered due to the difficulty for publishers to find their way between two modes of information collection. We are analyzing the possibility of using only Thema groupings. For now, to help the publisher, we have added a link to the EDItEUR interactive browser in the Canadian French language. Obviously, there is also space to add one or more qualifiers, like I said. The bibliographic space intended for our team is the interface for standardization, control, and rectification of data received from publisher by our bibliographic processing team. Regarding Thema, the interface allows to see the subjects that have been modified or added by the publishers and to correct and enrich them. On this slide, you see in the red circles the first Thema code transmitted by the publisher, and in each field, you see the last update he made. Our team will have to check and accept the modification or not. If we significantly change the publisher's Thema codes, we send them an email to tell them what we have corrected and why. This way, the publishers can learn and evolve their practices. Of course, we would like to automate more of these feedback in the future. As you possibly already know, Memento is the online catalog of French language books available in Canada, developed in collaboration with BookNet Canada. Bookstores, libraries, documentation center, etc. use Memento to consult order books, create records in their system, and populate their website. Thema is the only categorization displayed in Memento. BISAC is little used in the French-speaking book chain. Now, here is a preview of Thema in Memento. There are actually 3 ways to search from Thema in the search engine. First, by using the advanced search function by Thema subject. This function has to be improved, for an example, to have a better visualization in the search box and to be able to use a Boolean operators and instead of or. But it's possible, even if it's not obvious for the users, not really visible, to use Boolean research into the rapid search. I think the best way to have many results is to apply Thema filters on the broad search. So the more publishers use the potential of Thema and send us good subjects codes, the better their works appear in Memento search results. Finally, this is an example of how Thema categories appears in the notice display. For those who use Catalyst, you will recognize the environment. Like I said, 100% of the books in Memento have Thema subjects, since it is mandatory data for the BTLF. That being said, the BTLF exports controlled, structured data. This means not only valid ONIX files, but that also data standardized according to the BTLF ONIX template and whose content is validated, corrected, or even enriched by our bibliographic processing team, which will, for example, examine and validate the Thema categorization of each work, improve them from other available data if necessary, always according to our internal procedure for using Thema. The objective of this work is to act on the quality of data and Thema subjects. This means Thema topics without errors. The homogeneity, as much as possible, of referencing in order to optimize search results. The discoverability of books by having richer Thema subjects when it's possible. Like the Canadian market that imports data from other English-speaking countries, the BTLF imports data from other French-speaking countries. As you know, we don't always get exactly what we need for our market, and we have to adjust some data. The BTLF imports French data from EDItEUR. We standardize this data according to our ONIX BTLF export template, and we are currently working to improve our mapping in order to enrich the Thema referencing of French works on Memento compared to Canadian French works. This is a major project on which we are progressing slowly. Actually, EDItEUR sends us the theme and genre, which is a proprietary categorization scheme. We also receive Thema subjects from their mapping, but it is not always complete for our market. And we don't have a mention of the principal subject in the data. We have therefore set up at the BTLF a mapping which considers both the theme and genre and the Thema subjects submit in order to produce the best possible Thema categorization. It's the mapping that we need to improve and on which we are starting work. On the bookstore side, more and more bookstores are interested in Thema since it is the only categorization offered in Memento, but we don't have much information yet on how they use it. The editor documentation intended for booksellers was translated into French in January 2023. Sorry. We want to develop new channels of communication with booksellers about standards like Thema in 2025. On the publisher side, Quebec and Franco-Canadian publishers all send us Thema, but at different levels of quality. Our bibliographic processing team estimates that approximately 70 to 80% of publishers choose a good Thema main subject. 20 to 30% of publishers submit rich Thema subjects. 20 to 30% of the Thema subjects provided must necessarily be enriched by the team or modified. We also have super publishers who integrate Thema into their internal system and who train their teams. For example, this year, the Presse de l'Université du Québec integrated the latest version of Thema into their intranet and their working procedures. In summary, the improvement of practices surrounding Thema comes into use. To conclude on this portrait of the use of Thema in French-speaking Canada, here is what will occupy us in 2025 in relation to Thema. We will finalize the translation of Thema 1.6 in French Canadian. We'll integrate Thema 1.6 into the publisher space and Memento. We'll set up a communication department around book standards, including Thema. We'll work, as I said, to improve mapping for French Thema, and we'll finalize our internal Thema processing procedure for greater standardization of practices in our work team. That's it. Thank
you. Thanks, Isabelle, and thanks to BookNet Canada for organizing this afternoon's talk. So what I thought I'd do first is give you a brief reminder of what Thema is, for those of you who are less familiar with it. So Thema is an international multilingual book subject classification scheme designed for the international book trade. It's designed to meet all the needs of all the different parts of the book chain. So physical and digital, audio, and all the different types of publishers and booksellers. It is designed to help you merchandise titles, make their discoverability easier, and improve potential sales. It's very easy to use at its simplest form, but it's also been designed to facilitate post-coordinated searches. Every time we update it, it remains fully backward compatible, but we do update it, as we've done with 1.6, to meet the needs and the requirements of the book trade. And Thema is created and maintained by users. So it's not us at EDItEUR who simply add new codes. It's because parts of the book trade want those codes, which is part of the theme we're going to talk about this afternoon for Canada. So just a reminder of how Thema developed. As you can see on screen, version 1 came out in October 2013, and the latest version, 1.6, has just been published end of October 2024. So we have a 2-year cycle, and we intend to carry on with that 2-year cycle. So in theory, version 1.7 should be due in October, November 2026, and will remain fully backward compatible. How do we proceed with updates? So technically, we can say that the process for 1.7 has already started. So users of Thema, editor members, national user groups, make suggestions to EDItEUR. We compile all of these into lists and we share those with the national groups. We then form a cross-industry international working group that reviews all the suggestions for new codes. They look at things like, can this concept already be expressed using existing codes, but perhaps using different terminology? Can the concept be expressed with a combination of existing subject codes or subject codes and qualifiers? How many current commercial titles would use this new concept? Is it a huge area of publishing, or is it something that is important but lost in a larger subject code? Once we have a draft list, we send that out for review by national groups. We get feedback from them. And then finally, we publish a final draft that is validated by our International Steering Committee. And then afterwards, the new version is published. So 1.6, here's a few statistics for the new version. So as you can see, the number of new subject codes is 131, and we have 411 new qualifier codes. Version 1.6 has also a lot of updates to the notes. The notes, these updates are there to improve the discoverability of the right code, or to help explain usage scenarios for clarity, or to improve understanding for translation. All the existing codes remain valid. We do not depreciate or delete any codes, so there is no need to update existing metadata. However, it does no harm to review the new subject codes and qualifiers, look at your titles, and see if there are any that would benefit from using these new codes. And you can find a PDF with all the new subject codes and qualifiers on the same document, and this can be downloaded from the Thema page of the EDItEUR website. What else can you get from the EDItEUR website? There are various application notes, some of which have been translated, as Isabelle said, for example, into French. These give you information on how to use Thema. We make all the code lists available in all the translations in 4 formats: an Excel file, an HTML file, an XML file, and a JSON file. The Excel file is always a useful version to have. Because of the nature of Excel, it's easy to review everything or to create filtered searches to have a look and to get to know Thema. But there are other formats. This is the HTML. And this is part of the JSON version. We also have the online browser, and this too has been updated to version 1.6 and is available in all the translated languages. This is the French-Canadian version, which has the current 1.5 translation integrated into it. And when we receive the new updated translation that BTLF is working on, we'll add that to the browser and all the documentation. Now, finally, I wanted to remind you of the basic difference between the BISAC subject codes and Thema. So BISAC is a pre-coordinated system. This means the shelf label has been pre-decided for you, to put it very simply. You can use more than one subject code, but this means simply you can put the title on 2 different shelves. Sending more than one bisect code does not increase the number of options beyond the actual number sent. Thema is a post-coordinated scheme. So each code has a predefined meaning, and that meaning does not change. And you can send more than one code to say this title can go into this section or this section, like with bisect. However, Thema also encourages the use of faceted or filtered searching. You can use the combination of codes to create greater meaning. So in this example, any of the 3 subject codes could be combined by the data receiver with the qualifier for Winnipeg. Also, any of the 3 subject codes can be used with each other to create or refine the meaning. Effectively, it is the difference between a system of predefined shelf labels and an ability to create multiple combinations and a greater range of choice for retailers or libraries of how they classify titles or the ability to discover these titles. To put it simply, Thema has a building block approach. Now, this ability to use a combination means that you can effectively create multiple sections without having to have a code for every single one. So we could take the qualifier for Winnipeg and create different Winnipeg sections. It also provides a way of linking titles across subjects, across genres, and across age groups. So, for example, we could have all the travel guides to Winnipeg or create a travel Winnipeg section in our bookshop. Or maybe a social history section dedicated to Winnipeg. Or maybe we would want to search for romance novels set in Winnipeg. Or maybe we'd like to look for more obscure subjects, at least in Canada, like ice hockey. Sorry, that was a joke. Now I'll pass you back to Isabelle.
Okay, that should be okay now. Yes. Okay, thank you, Chris. So now I will quickly introduce you to Thema's decolonization work carried out by French and English Canada in anticipation of version 1.6 of Thema. Let's begin by some context elements. In 2022, as Thema soon celebrated its 10th anniversary, Pope Francis apologized to Indigenous Canadians for the mistreatment they suffered at the hands of the member of the Catholic Church in Canada's residential school system. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, recalled that the residential school system attempted to assimilate Indigenous children. They were forced to abandon their language, their culture, their spirituality, their traditions, and their identity. As he pointed out that day, count yourself lucky it's rare that I quote a Canadian Prime Minister twice in a year. Reconciliation is the business of all Canadians. I would like to say that I gave this presentation in Frankfurt this year with Lauren Stewart, and she had used this very interesting definition of the term reconciliation in publishing that I would like to steal from her today. So in publishing, we could say that reconciliation is the social responsibility to ensure that all individuals have equal opportunities for accurate representation and that readers have the ability to receive this information as authentically as possible. I'd also like to share with you this very enlightening quote from Elizabeth Barker from Orca Book Publishers that Lauren read in Frankfurt. And I'll take a break here and just click on play. Warning, the voice you will hear is not the voice of Elizabeth Barker, but that of a colleague who was kind enough to play the game with me. Maybe you'll have to pump up the volume a bit. Oops, sorry.
The majority of our indigenous titles exist outside of a Western framework in terms of narrative structure and or style. Trying to categorize these so they fit into standards can be a frustrating experience and is a drain on staff time and energy, as often we must think of alternative ways to express the information we wish the codes would. It is hard not to feel as though we are doing a disservice to not only the spirit of the books, but the supply chain itself. We are creating content to meet a demand, but we cannot convey that given what is currently available.
I think I missed the first part. Sorry.
Many of our indigenous titles and the indigenous titles we distribute don't fit into any category cleanly. It is difficult to not only use, but convince others, often of indigenous ancestry, to assign codes that either demean or diminish their content. Many of our juvenile books, for example, impart teaching or creation stories passed on through generations and, outside of the book industry, are not seen as myths or legends, but as stories of spiritual significance. Often we must categorize this as fiction, which not only restricts discoverability, but impart completely incorrect information.
Very sorry for having
the majority of
So I will not play again the second part. Sorry for this. So in 2023, it appeared essential for BTLF and BookNet, as for other book organizations around the world, to begin work to decolonize Thema with EDItEUR. But what does it mean exactly? It does not mean Thema is bad and full of outdated expressions from a colonial past, but there may be some language terms that are dated or missing, and we add to update and add these. Concretely, the work in question here is above all one of listening. For us, its objective is to ensure that Thema allows you to identify and categorize in appropriate terms and language Canadian Indigenous content or content relating to Canadian Indigenous peoples in order to increase, among other things, its discoverability. We achieve this by shifting the colonialist focus used by default, often unconsciously, but fortunately we are increasingly aware of it, and by embracing the diversity of cultures, peoples, and nations. What is interesting in Quebec is that we benefit for this project not only from the point of view of the book chain, but also from the academic and institutional point of view of Laval University. Indeed, BTLF has opened a channel of communication and collaboration with the RVM team at Laval University, who are working in parallel on the decolonization of subject headings. As indicated on the website of Laval University Répertoire des Vedettes Matières, RVM, the vocabulary describing Indigenous peoples presents significant cultural, historical, and colonial biases. It is imperative to revise this terminology with respect for Indigenous communities. For several months, the RVM team has undertaken an ambitious project, namely to review all of the subject headings describing Indigenous peoples. So by pulling our respective work carried out in parallel, we learn from each other and can validate certain questions about concepts and language. In fact, decolonization is part of a broader perspective of inclusion. We believe that if book standards such as Thema and only focused on reflecting the contents of the majority of published books, many contents would remain in the shadow and could never be fully identified and discovered. However, as we all know, one of the primary purposes of metadata is to play an essential role in discoverability. Our experience in Quebec and Canada proved it, and we believe in the important role of the book industry in changing standards with the time. A good example of this change of state of mind is that while working on the decolonization of Thema with our Indigenous committees, we realized at the BTLF that a significant French-speaking Canadian minority was absent from Thema, the people of Acadia. We have therefore integrated the new codes in version 1.6 to be able to categorize books on their literature, their history, their territory. Here is some examples of new subjects or modifications made for the 1.6 version of Thema that will increase the discoverability of Canadian Indigenous content or content relating to Canadian Indigenous peoples. So on this slide, you see which Thema codes the publisher gave us using the version 1.5 and what it could be using the next version, 1.6, for the book Laughing with the Trickster, Rire avec le Trickster by Tom Highway. Mainly for this book, the new code FNT, Trickster Stories and Tales, can be added. In Thema, FNT is under FN, which was fiction, traditional stories, myths, and fairy tales. In 1.6 version, the new wording of FN is now traditional or cultural fiction and true stories, tales, and retellings. I would like to emphasize the importance of these true stories in the wording. Like we saw in many Indigenous cultures, there is no clear distinction between fiction and non-fiction. Stories plays a fundamental role in the transmission of knowledge, social cohesion, etc. And if you want to know more about the trickster, here is a short portrait, and I quote, "In Indigenous cultures and myths, there is a mysterious character with multiple forms. The trickster, literally the one who plays tricks. He can be both a scorned foreigner and a cultural hero. Beyond his appetite for play, he brings the necessary balance to the life of communities. He makes people laugh in sadness, and he moderates the most optimists. It's an important figure that has to be in Thema because several books by Indigenous authors or about Indigenous cultures are interested in it. Turtle Islands, the code 1QPB. As you maybe know, several Indigenous peoples refer to the continent of North America as Turtle Island. This name derives from various original Indigenous oral stories alluding to a turtle holding the world on its back. It was important for BTLF and BookNet to integrate the terms used by Indigenous peoples, among others to designate periods, but also to designate places, with the aim here of being able to correctly identify books which express a different notion of territory without the colonial notion of borders. The code 3 languages, 2G and CE, was already there since 1.4 version, so it shows the work of communication will have to do with publishers too, to improve discoverability. Finally, we notice the addition of the new code relating to First Nation, 5PBCAA. In the 1.6 version, the three main Indigenous groups of Canada have been added: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This offers better possibilities for documentary referencing, but also for research, which will have a positive impact on discoverability. Here you have a book for children about the Métis culture. In the 1.5 version, WBN was national and regional cuisine. The national and regional concepts have been revisited with the broader notion of peoples and cultures. Other subjects have also been modified according to this new, more inclusive light. As you can see here, the new code relating to Métis should be added too. Here, finally, you have a book of the Presse de l'Université Laval, Laval Press University, that belongs to the Oral Tradition collection. In 1.5 version, NHKA was History of the Americas pre-Columbian period. The term pre-Columbian was inappropriate to designate the long and rich history of the Native Americans before colonizations. As we all know now, Christopher Columbus was far from being respectful of the natives. For lack of anything better, but it is a significant improvement for our indigenous committees, the term pre-contact was chosen. This is a really good example of looking at use of language in pre-existing Thema codes and how they have to evolve to become neutral, but also remain understandable across languages and cultures. For the code DH, oral literature, this addition is a good example of how we add some new codes or update some existing codes to reflect different ways of expression, communication, transmission, and learning. Like the journalist Catherine Denizet wrote, orality among indigenous peoples is far from being folkloric and superfluous, even if this is often the image that colonial heritage sells us. This tradition is regaining strength in a myriad of sectors of contemporary society, ranging from ecology to law. It was important in the 1.6 version of Thema to include orality in both fiction and non-fiction categories. Oral literature, oral transmission, oral legal traditions, history, cultural worldviews and spiritual beliefs, etc. 1QPB and 5PB-CAA. Here, these new codes that we already mentioned, Turtle Island and relating to First Nation, could appear too for this book. The BTLF therefore worked hand in hand with BookNet to identify important concepts for the book chain in Quebec and Canada. We found that a good way to operate is to process with working groups. Each of our organizations set up a small committee and worked with Indigenous people acting as consultant on the project. For the BTLF, it is mainly Daniel Siwi from the Wendat Nation, director of Édition et Librairie à Nenorak in Quebec, who helps us to develop our thinking and to reflect from an Indigenous perspective. I cannot emphasize enough the richness and importance of his contribution to this project. Thanks also to the Indigenous content publishers who contributed to the project. BookNet, BTLF, and EDItEUR held monthly monitoring meetings to better supervise the progress of the work. I think everyone will agree that our regular exchanges have been essential for untangling concepts, pooling needs and knowledge, evolving our tasks according to our objective, always within the framework of the possibilities offered by the standardized structure of Thema. Finally, this project would not have been possible without the help of all its participants, both in French and English Canada, whom I would like to warmly thank. Thank you all for your listening.
Thank you, Isabelle. I have to say that for me personally, this has been a very interesting project, and I have learned an awful lot through this whole process. Now, I'm going to look at some of the areas where the work of the two Canadian groups led to the addition of new subject codes or qualifiers to version 1.6, or where the work of these two groups led to an update in wording or the addition of notes. What I'm going to show you are just a few examples of the additions and changes that were made, and I recommend you have a look at the documentation and the new versions to explore all the possibilities. Now, let's start with place qualifiers. Place qualifiers are used in Thema to say that my book is about a place, or the action of my book takes place in this setting. There are a lot of codes that already exist for Canada, have been there since the beginning, but new codes have been added, and notes as well, to improve discoverability and visibility of names, including names in Indigenous languages. Greater detail has been added for Canada by including the names of the larger cities, as well as the existing notes for the codes for the areas. And we've added in notes of the recommendation from the Canadian groups, added notes mentioning some of the neighbourhoods that may appear in books. We've added things like a new code for Canada's Arctic islands. And as Isabelle mentioned, we've added in a new code for the cultural region of Acadia. We also added into the place qualifiers a new concept of Indigenous geographies and territorialities. And we've done it in a way so they're not associated with any of the existing country structures or country codes, and so that they can be used with other place qualifiers or with any other subject or qualifier. And we've started by adding two: Turtle Island, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and what I think is pronounced Abya Yala, forgive me if I've mispronounced it, which is used similarly for what we call South America. We've added in new qualifiers for Indigenous ceremonies and a specific code for powwow and stomp dance. There's a new qualifier for Indigenous elders. And as a qualifier, it can be used with titles aimed at adults, at children, at teenagers, and across genre, along with the existing qualifiers about gender identity and sexuality. There's a new qualifier specifically for Indigiqueer and Two-Spirit peoples. As any of you who use Thema will know, there are already a lot of qualifiers to identify content about or relating to specific groups or identities, but we've added some specific ones for Canada, some of which Isabelle has mentioned. So we have 3 new qualifiers, one for the First Nations, one for the Inuit, and one for the Métis. We've also added a new code for the Acadian people plus 7 broad categories for the different major Canadian diaspora groups. And as always in Thema, or nearly always, we've added notes to help discoverability and also explain how they can be used. The notes allow us to add in terms that may be searched for or particular codes to lead people to that particular code. Language qualifiers, which in Thema are used to identify that the content is about a language, learning that language, about reviving that language, about the speakers of that language, etc. Not to say that the book is in a language that is dealt with in Onyx. Again, we've added some new codes to improve discoverability and improved some of the notes. Languages in Thema is an interesting area as they show one area of discussion, which is very common when reviewing standards. Thema is global, so we have to get the balance right between making sure it is understandable around the globe and across cultures and for different language users. So we will use values that are recognized by international standards, like the ISO codes, the ISO codes for languages, which are used in many different data systems. But we also need to allow for endonyms, or the names that the speakers of the language themselves use. So some of our headers have multiple terms, or we may feature different names in the notes. And this is an area where people who speak these languages or write in these languages, excuse me, write in these languages or publish in these languages can help with feedback through BookNet Canada and BTLF. As Isabelle mentioned, we've also been looking at the subject codes. For example, the fiction area for children and teenagers already had a code called Fiction and True Stories, but we've added in some subcodes to that. And as you can see, that includes trickster tales, teaching stories, creation, founding, and origin stories. We've also added in to this same area a new code, YNMR, which allows you to identify works about life on reservations or reserves. We've also been adding in codes or revising codes in other areas. So we've put in a new code for oral literature, or orality and oral transmission, or language revitalization or revival. In the law section, there are new codes. There's a new code to identify Indigenous systems of law, books about that. We've included a new code for Indigenous land rights and property rights, which includes in the notes concepts like free, prior, and informed consent. Like in the children's and teenage area, we've also added a new code in the social sciences, JB-SB, for reservation and equivalence, which could be used for fiction or non-fiction, and can cover things like what I believe is called res-lit. A new code that was actually suggested by the Ukrainian group because of its importance in their own history and literature, with problems with forced Russification, is JBFB2, but we've put it in as a general code, so it will work, for example, for the Canadian market, for works on Canada's own history or social sciences or fiction. An interesting new code is NHTB1, which has been a hard code to write a label for because it's trying to cover a lot of interactions in human history, some of which have been very important, and that's why the notes are very important here. And as Isabelle mentioned, we also revisited the wording for NHKA, which removed the notion of pre-Columbian and changed it to pre-contacts, where we chose the plural, as that seemed to be even more inclusive than just choosing a singular pre-contact. May not be the most perfect term yet, but again, it's seen as a more neutral term, but also still understandable in different cultures and different languages. Trickster Tales was added to the adult section, and we revised the heading to make sure it, like already in the children's section, it included that notion of true stories. But we did other updates that will be good for the Canadian market. We made a lot of updates to the romance section. Although I have to confess, the working group turned down a new code for cinnamon roll romance as being a bit too niche. We thought it would sit nicely under the new code for cozy romance. We also added in some new narrative themes. So there's a new one for animals. So stories, fiction that features animals. So we thought it would help with all those books about cats in bookshops. We also put in a new narrative theme about books and the world of books. And finally, a major new addition to Thema are qualifiers to identify the literature of place. That is the literature of a country or a region. And we've even got a new code for the literature of Canada and the literature of Quebec. And I have a summary slide, but I am going to skip that because I'm conscious of the time. You will have copies of these slides. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Chris and Isabelle. Oh, that was really, it was great. And unfortunately, we really are out of time because we need to make a hard stop at 3. So there have been a couple of questions which we'll deal with, directly with the people. And if anybody does have questions, please send them to BookNet Canada, and we'll be happy to work with either Chris, Isabelle, or answer them ourselves. Before we go, we'd love it if you give us some feedback. So we're dropping a link into the presentation, into the presentation chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out, and we'll be emailing it to you. To our attendees, we'll invite you to our next upcoming session, Breaking the Mold, Crowdfunding for Publishing Projects, November 26th. For information about all upcoming events, go to our website, bnctechforum.ca. And lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through Canada Book Fund. We'd like to thank you all for attending. And well done, Isabelle and Chris. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.